Adding rational expressions is a lot like adding fractions, and if you remember when you were adding fractions, you needed a lowest common denominator, and we're lucky enough that we have a lowest common denominator here. It's 9. So remember, when we're adding, we keep the same denominator, and all we have to do is add the numerators together. So when I add the numerators, that's an xy plus z. There's nothing else I can do to simplify that, so that is my final answer, believe it or not. It's the same idea when we're subtracting, right? We keep the lowest common denominator, which is x squared, and just subtract the top and the numerator. So that's going to be a y minus 6. It's that operation up there that deals with the numerators. And again, there's nothing else we can do here. So we are done with this problem. Enjoy the short ones while you can. This one looks a little bit more complicated, but don't be scared. It's the same idea. The lowest common denominator is 5y, so it's just going to stay there. Now we're going to go ahead and add the numerators together. So that's an x plus 3 plus an x plus 4. We got some like terms we can combine there. We can combine the x's together, and we can also go ahead and combine the 3 and the 4 together. So that's going to come out to be 2x on the top plus 7 all over 5y. That's it. That's my final answer there. Same type of thing here. The lowest common denominator is 3x squared, so I'm going to keep that. But one little tiny thing to worry about here is when you're subtracting the x plus 2, that minus sign really applies to the entire x plus 2. So one way for me to write this would be 5 minus, and then in parentheses, I'm going to put in the x plus 2. It's very important you do that because you have to subtract the x and you have to subtract the 2. So really, when you distribute that negative, you can think of it like a negative 1. It's a 5 minus x minus 2 all over 3x squared. Let's go ahead and combine the like terms. We can combine the 5 with the negative 2. That comes out to be 3 minus x all over 3x squared. And remember from the last section that 3 minus x are not factors of each other. They are subtracted from one another, so nothing here can cancel out. That is my final answer. Okay, here's where it starts getting a little bit tricky. You knew it was coming, right? So here we don't have a lowest common denominator, so we have to find the lowest common denominator. And it's a little bit difficult because we have a variable next with the number. So the lowest common denominator has to fit 4 and it has to fit x. And the only number that can do that is 4x, right? Because if you try to divide that 4 on the bottom into 4x, you can do that. And if you try to divide this x into the 4x, you can do that as well. So the lowest common denominator here is 4x. Okay, so then I have to build up these fractions to get a 4x on the bottom, right? So remember that that first one just had a 4 on the bottom, and the second one only had an x on the bottom. Okay? So I have to ask myself, what is this first fraction missing to get the LCD, which is 4x? And it's missing an x. I'm going to multiply that one by x, which means I also have to multiply the top by x. And this bottom fraction, this other fraction is missing a 4 to make that 4x. I'm going to multiply the top and the bottom by 4. So that changes my fractions a little bit now. Now what I have is a 3x on the top plus an 8. 3x came from here, the 8 came from here, all over the same denominator, which was 4x. Okay, and finally there's nothing I can do to simplify this, so that is my final answer. I'm going to do something very similar here. We have to look for the lowest common denominator, and if the lowest common denominator has to fit x and y, then the lowest common denominator must be x times y, because it fits both the x and the y if I try to divide them in there. So I'm going to start with what I have, which is a 5 over an x minus a 7 over a y, and I'm going to multiply them by what they're missing. So this first fraction was missing the y component, so I have to multiply that first fraction by y on the top and the bottom. And the second fraction was missing the x component, so I have to multiply by x in the top and the bottom. Don't let this x times y confuse you with the y times x. They're the same thing. Remember, multiplication is commutative. That means that the order can change. So when I go ahead and put this all under the same denominator, the denominator is just x times y, I get a 5y from the first fraction minus a 7y from the second fraction. So that is my final answer. I have now subtracted those two rational expressions. Let's once again try to identify the lowest common denominator. So let's see, the lowest common denominator has to divide 6 and 2. The smallest number that can divide 6 and 2 is 6, because 6 fits inside the lowest common denominator, as well as this 2 fits inside the lowest common denominator. Okay, now if it has to divide an x squared or an x, then the lowest common denominator has to have an x squared in it, right? X squared fits inside the x squared, and x fits inside the x squared. Finally, it has to divide this y or this y squared, so the only number that can do that, the smallest number that can do that, is y squared. Okay, so once again, the lowest common denominator has to be able to fit everything in the denominators. So if we look over here, it fits the 6, it fits the x squared, it fits the y, it fits the 2, the x, and the y squared. And when I say fits, I'm talking about division. Okay, so let's write what we have. We have a 7 over 6x squared y plus a 3 over 2x y squared. We're going to multiply by what's missing. So if I compare this denominator to my lowest common denominator, the only thing it's missing, it already has the 6, the x squared, and one of the y's. So the only thing it's missing, it's an additional y. So I'm just multiplying that additional y there. Okay? The second one has a factor of 2, a single x, and 2y. So it's missing a factor when I'm comparing it to the LCD. It's missing a factor of 3, so the 2 and the 3 give me 6. And it's also missing an x, so that the x and the x multiply to x squared. So I need to multiply that on the top and the bottom. Okay? So now I'm in luck, because when I multiply the denominator together, it's 6x squared y squared. You should double check that this and this both multiply to 6x squared y squared. Okay, let's multiply the top here. That's a 7y, and this right here is a 9x. And I'm done. That is my final answer. So the hardest part here is finding the lowest common denominator and making the fractions have that lowest common denominator. This is our last example. Let's find the lowest common denominator. Remember that the lowest common denominator has to divide everything in here. So in order to divide that 2, the LCD needs a 2. In order to divide the x to the 5th or the x squared, it needs an x to the 5th. That x to the 5th will be able to fit either the x to the 5th or the x squared inside of it. And it also needs to have a y so that it can fit that other y inside of it. Okay? So if you try to fit the x to the 5th, we're good. If you try to fit the 2, we're good. If you try to fit the x squared, it fits inside x to the 5th. And if you try to fit the y, then that's also good. Okay, so our next step is to kind of build up these fractions so that they have the lowest common denominator we need. So let's write what we have. We have a 3y over x to the 5th minus a 5 over 2x squared y. So let's identify what's missing. This first fraction, when I compare it to the lowest common denominator, is missing a factor of 2, and it's also missing a factor of y. Okay? The second fraction, when I compare it to the lowest common denominator, is missing, let's see, it has the 2, it has the y, and it has 2 of the x's, so it's missing 3 more x's. So I'm going to multiply it by x cubed. So when it's all said and done, my denominator should be the same. It should be 2x to the 5th y. And go ahead and double check that those denominators both multiply to 2x to the 5th y. And I'm going to multiply this top part of my fraction. That comes out to be 6y squared minus this bottom part, this top part of my second fraction, which is 5x cubed.